The day I understood what it meant to be human, really understood it, not just intellectually, not just as something written in a philosophy text from 3 centuries ago, was the day I watched a man from Earth walk into a room full of beings that could kill him 17 different ways before he finished his first sentence, and he did it anyway. He didn't walk in angry. He didn't walk in scared either, though he should have been. He walked in like he had somewhere to be. That detail, that small, unremarkable detail, stayed with me longer than anything else that happened in the tribunal hall of Vethar Station that morning. Not the verdict that had already been written, not the accused standing on the platform in chains made of compressed light. Not even the silence that fell over 400 beings from 37 different species when he opened his mouth. Just the way he walked, like he had somewhere to be. My name is Oren Sellers. I was 31 years old when I witnessed what the galactic press later called the Vethar incident. I was working as a junior documentation clerk for the Interspecies Tribunal Authority, which is exactly as boring as it sounds. My job was to sit in the observer gallery, keep a running log of proceedings, and make sure the timestamps matched the audio archive. 8 hours a day, 5 days a cycle. For 3 years I had done this job without ever seeing anything worth writing down beyond the basic summary. I'd watched corporate disputes between Delvari mining conglomerates and sect water authorities. I'd watched border reclassification so dry they made the Delvari disputes look like theater. I'd watched a 6-hour proceeding about whether a Gorathi merchant had the legal right to sell preserved protein supplements in a sector where the dominant species found the smell offensive. I thought I'd seen everything the tribunal could produce. I was wrong. Vethar Station sits at the intersection of 3 galactic trade corridors, which means it's permanently crowded, permanently loud, and permanently smelling of at least 4 different species food preparations competing for dominance in the recycled air. The station is old, older than the current tribunal authority, older than the accord of 12 voices that established it, and you can feel that age in the walls, in the slight vibration that runs through the floor panels on level 6, where the gravity regulators are losing their calibration. I liked level 6. I liked the vibration. It reminded you the station was alive, that there were mechanical systems underneath all the bureaucratic procedure and formal language and species-specific protocol that kept this place running. The tribunal hall on level 8 didn't vibrate. It was perfectly calibrated, temperature-controlled to a median tolerance for 12 attending species, acoustically designed so that every word spoken at the central platform reached every gallery seat with equal clarity. The lighting was neutral. The seating was modular. Everything about it was designed to feel objective. I always thought it felt like a room that had been designed by something that didn't quite understand what fairness actually was. It understood the appearance of fairness. It had studied it very carefully and reproduced every surface detail correctly. But something was missing in the middle. The case of Salvin Krath was assigned to Hall 3, which was the mid-sized hall, used for proceedings of significant but not galactic crisis-level concern. I logged it into my queue the night before without reading past the header. I was tired. I'd done a 12-hour shift covering a maritime boundary dispute, and my eyes were burning from the transcript light. I read the case file the next morning on the shuttle ride up to level 8, and by the time the shuttle stopped, I'd read it 3 times. The accused was a female of the Vethkani species, Salvin Krath. Age, 47 cycles, which put her in early adulthood by Vethkani standards. The Vethkani were one of the station's founding species, tall, silver-skinned, with elongated skulls and eyes that shifted color depending on what information their neuroloptical system was currently processing. They were one of the most intellectually advanced species in the known sectors. They had contributed more to galactic mathematics, theoretical physics, and computational architecture than any other single species in the last 200 cycles. They were also, And I want to be careful with how I say this because it's important for understanding what happened, profoundly and systematically without emotion. Not incapable of emotion, that's a crucial distinction. Without emotion, by choice, by law. By a cultural infrastructure so deep and so old that questioning it was categorized as a form of mental illness. The Vethkani had decided, approximately 900 cycles ago, that emotion was a cognitive contamination, that it interfered with accurate processing, with optimal decision-making, with species-wide efficiency. They had developed neurological suppression techniques that, over generations, had become hereditary. Vethkani children were born with significantly reduced emotional response centers. The ones that still showed signs of emotional processing, empathy, attachment, what humans would call love, were identified early and treated. The treatment was considered a kindness. The accusation against Sylvan Krath was this: that she had willfully and repeatedly experienced, expressed, and facilitated emotional response in violation of Vethkani purity doctrine, Article 9, subsection 4, and that she had done so in a manner likely to cause contamination risk to other Vethkani residing on Vethar Station. The prosecution was being conducted by her twin brother. His name was Sylvan Krath. He had brought the charges himself. I want to stop here because I think you need to sit with that for a moment, the way I had to sit with it on the shuttle. A twin brother who brought charges against his sister. Not because she hurt someone, not because she stole something or violated a border or broke a trade agreement, because she had feelings. And the penalty, under Vethkani law, which the tribunal was obligated to consider since Vethar Station had signed the Vethkani Sovereignty Compact 40 years prior, was death by cognitive termination. They called it termination, like she was a program with an error in the code. I sat in my documentation chair in the observer gallery, and I looked at my timestamp log and I thought, I am about to watch a species execute one of their own for the crime of feeling something. And my job is to make sure the audio archive matches the transcript. I almost left. I want to be honest about that. I almost logged a medical absence and went back to my quarters and let someone else cover Hall 3. I didn't, partly because I needed the shift credit. Partly because I didn't quite believe it would go the way the case file suggested. The tribunal had review authority. Someone would intervene. That's what I told myself. Sylvan Krath was brought into the hall at precisely 900 station time. She was tall, like all Vethkani, but she walked differently than the others I'd seen in the station corridors. Vethkani typically moved with a kind of frictionless efficiency, every step calculated, nothing wasted. She moved like she was uncertain where the floor was, like each step was a small decision she was making separately from the last one. Her eyes were blue-gray, which I recognized from the file as unusual. Most Vethkani eyes were silver or gold, reflecting the neuroloptical dominance. Blue-gray meant the emotional processing centers were active, visible. It was the thing her brother had brought to court as evidence. Her wrists were bound in the compressed light chains, standard tribunal restraint. She was wearing Vethkani formal attire, a structured silver garment that looked almost architectural, but it was wrinkled at the collar, which, for a Vethkani, was genuinely startling. Their sensory awareness of physical presentation was typically precise. She was scared. I could see it. Not in any way that would have been legible to every species in the room, but to me, having spent 3 years watching beings go through some of the worst moments of their lives in this building, I knew what fear looked like. She was absolutely terrified. She walked to the central platform and stood in the position she'd been instructed to stand in, and she looked out at the gallery and then at the judicial bench and then at the space in front of her, and she didn't look at her brother. He was already seated at the prosecution table. Sylvan Krath was taller than his sister by several inches. His skull structure was more pronounced. the elongated crown more defined, and his eyes were gold, bright and static, and processing at what I could tell from the slight vibration in his temples was extremely high capacity. He was dressed in what I later identified as the formal attire of a Vethkani academic, which held significant status. He looked at his sister once when she walked in. His eyes didn't change color. His expression didn't change. He looked at her the way you might look at a piece of equipment that has malfunctioned and needs to be decommissioned. Then he looked away. And she noticed. I saw her notice. Her shoulders moved barely, almost nothing, but they dropped slightly, and I understood that she had still, even now, been hoping for something from him. Some recognition, some acknowledgement that they had once been children together, that they had shared something once before the doctrine had taken everything from him. She got nothing. She turned back to the platform, and she stood there alone. The presiding judicial officer was a Gorathi named Thesson Vor, which was fortunate. The Gorathi are slow-speaking and methodical, and their legal tradition puts enormous weight on procedural exactness, which meant Thesson Vor was going to give this proceeding more time and more scrutiny than most. She was seated at the center of the three-being judicial bench, flanked by a Delvari named Carol Umith and a sect named Quinsectalaris, who went by Alaris for tribunal records. Thesson Vor called the session to order at 9:02. She read the charges in the official three-language format, Galactic Standard, Vethkani High Dialect, and the Gorathi Legal Register. Her voice was deep and rhythmic, and she took her time. Some of the gallery shifted restlessly. 400 beings, 2/3 of them present because this was a significant Vethkani case, and the station's Vethkani community had packed the observer seats, and the rest either press or documentation clerks or curiosity-driven citizens who'd heard about it the way you hear about things on a station, through the atmospheric noise of shared corridors and food halls. I logged the opening, timestamp 902.17, case designation VTA 3391 SKR, presiding, Thesson Vor Gorathi, accused, Salvan Krath, Vethkani female, resident Vethar Station Level 4. I kept my log clean and professional. Inside, my hands were cold. Valvan Krath gave the opening statement for the prosecution himself, which was unusual. Typically, even species-internal cases brought before the tribunal used a licensed advocate. He had waived advocate representation. When Thesson Vor noted this for the record, he inclined his head in a gesture that I recognized as Vethkani formal acknowledgement and said, in perfect galactic standard, "I am the closest witness to the accused's contamination. I am the most qualified to present the evidence. Advocate distance would reduce precision." His voice was extraordinary. I wrote that in my personal notes later, the ones I kept separate from the official log. Not his voice in terms of tone or warmth, there was nothing warm about it, but in terms of precision. Every syllable placed with a kind of absolute deliberateness that made every word feel like it weighed something exact. He presented the prosecution's case in 27 minutes. 27 minutes to lay out the argument for why his sister should die. He covered the evidence systematically. Recorded observations of emotional response in public spaces, neurological scan data from the Vethkani Community Health Monitor, to which all station residents of their species were required to submit, testimony from 3 other Vethkani residents who had observed her behavior and filed community contamination reports, and a series of what he called contamination incident reports, moments where Salvan had displayed emotional response in proximity to other Vethkani. The most damning item in his presentation was a recording, an audio-visual capture from a public corridor on Level 4, 3 months prior. In it, you could see Salvan walking with a small being, a Tylish child, one of the round, 6-limbed species that are common in that section of the station, extremely young and very clearly lost and distressed. You could see the child's distress signals, the body curled, the limbs contracted, the subvocal sounds that Tylish make when frightened. You could see Selvin stop. You could see her crouch down, which for a Vethkani of her height was a significant physical act, and you could see her speak to the child. And then you could see her reach out, carefully, slowly, so as not to startle, and rest the tips of her fingers on the child's nearest limb in a gesture that was, unmistakably, comfort. The child stilled, the contracted limbs loosened slightly, the subvocal sounds quieted. Selvin had then stood, looked around, found a passing Tylish adult further down the corridor and called to them. The adult came. The child was reunited. The adult made the deep Tylish bow of profound gratitude. Selvin had watched them go. And then she had turned back to walking, and on her face, for just a moment, there was something that every being in that gallery who had ever felt anything recognized immediately. Satisfaction, not pride, not victory, just the quiet warmth of having done something that mattered. Velvin Krath presented this as his primary evidence. Exhibit 7, he said in that precise, unweighted voice. Emotional response resulting in physical contact with a non-Vethkani being. Response type, empathic. Duration, 3 minutes 22 seconds. Contamination risk, high due to observation by 3 resident Vethkani who were in the corridor at the time. He didn't mention the child. He didn't mention that she'd helped a lost, frightened child find its parent. He just presented the scan data showing her neural emotional activity during the event, and moved on to the next exhibit. I had covered a lot of cases. I had watched a lot of prosecution presentations. I had never, not once, wanted to throw something at the prosecution table. I kept my hands very still, and I kept logging, and I kept my face neutral because documentation clerks are required to maintain observer neutrality, and I was a professional, and I was good at my job. But I want to be honest, something changed in me during those 27 minutes. Some understanding clicked into place about what cruelty could look like when it wore the costume of logic, about what it meant to pathologize the things that make someone worth knowing. Selvin's court-appointed defense advocate was a Delvari named Oreth Sen who I recognized from 3 previous cases. Oreth was competent, methodical, and completely out of her depth. Delvari legal tradition is built around property rights and contractual obligation. It's not well suited to cases about the philosophical legitimacy of an emotional suppression doctrine. Oreth presented the defense in good faith and with genuine effort, but she was arguing on the Vethkani's terms, which meant she was arguing from a position that conceded the underlying premise, that the doctrine itself was valid. She argued mitigation. She argued that Selvin's emotional responses had occurred in contexts that were either private or had produced net positive community outcomes. She cited the Tylish child incident specifically. She cited Vethkani medical literature, suggesting that complete emotional suppression in individuals with active processing centers could produce neurological damage. Velvin rebutted each point with the precision of a surgical instrument. To the community outcome argument, community outcomes cannot be used to justify contamination risk. The precedent would allow unlimited emotional expression, provided the actor could demonstrate a positive outcome, which makes doctrine enforcement impossible. To the medical literature, the literature cited represents a minority position within Vethkani academic consensus and has not been accepted by the doctrine authority. To the mitigation plea overall, mitigation does not apply to ideological contamination. This is established precedent. The accused has willfully and repeatedly violated purity doctrine. The appropriate response under Article 9 is termination. I am requesting the tribunal ratify the community court's finding. Thessenvor called a recess. The recess was 40 minutes. I stayed in the gallery. Most people did. You could feel the weight of what was happening, not just in the human way I felt it, but in the way the gallery itself changed. The sound shifted. Smaller conversations, lower register, more uncertain. Even the species that had come in clearly aligned with the prosecution, the Vethkani community block in the upper gallery, were quieter than they'd been at the opening. I was 3 rows from the front of the observer gallery, close enough to see the defense table clearly. Oreth Sen sat with Salvin during the recess. She was showing her something on a data tablet. Salvin listened. She nodded once or twice. Her eyes had shifted toward a darker blue since the prosecution presentation. Darker blue in Vethkani language meant heightened emotional activity, which under the circumstances seemed unavoidable, and she held her bound hands very still in her lap like she was concentrating very hard on keeping them still. At one point, she looked up from the tablet and she caught my eye. I don't know why she looked at that particular section of the gallery at that particular moment, but she did. And we held eye contact for about 3 seconds, which was long enough for me to feel, with absolute certainty, that she knew what was coming. She looked away first, back to the tablet. I looked down at my log. Timestamp 947.33. Recess continues. The gallery door opened on the east side, which was the public entry, not the restricted observer access I'd come through. Late admission, which was unusual. Once a session was in progress, the doors were supposed to stay sealed during recess. They just usually weren't because security in Hall 3 was more informal than Hall 1. I noticed because of the sound. The east door makes a specific sound when it opens, a seal break followed by the change in air pressure. And I had been in this hall enough times that I heard it even when I wasn't consciously listening for it. I looked up. A human walked in. I want to describe this carefully because I've told this story before, to friends, to journalists, to the tribunal review board that investigated the incident 3 months later, and the description of the man matters more than most people realize. He was not a large man. I want to establish that first because in retrospect, a lot of people assumed he must have been physically imposing. He wasn't. He was average height for a human male, which is maybe 3/4 of Vethkani standard, with the kind of build that suggested physical fitness but not exceptional size. He had dark skin and close-cropped hair, and he was wearing what I later identified as the uniform of a United Earth diplomatic auxiliary, which is a real thing but a relatively minor one, a kind of interspecies liaison branch that handles smaller tribunal proceedings on behalf of Earth's galactic compact membership. He was carrying a data case, the kind advocates use, and he was moving through the gallery toward the front with the energy of someone who was late and knew it, and had decided that knowing it was enough and walking faster would cover the rest. He slid into the seat behind the defense advocate table without asking anyone, opened the data case on his knees, and started reading. Oreth Sen looked at him, he looked at her. He said something in a low voice that I couldn't hear from where I sat. Whatever he said, Oreth Sen's expression shifted from exhausted professional competence to something more uncertain. Not bad uncertain, just recalibrating. She nodded once. He nodded back and kept reading. Thesson Vor called the session back to order at 10:27. She asked Oreth Sen if the defense had anything to add before the judicial panel began deliberation. Oreth Sen stood. She said, "The defense requests the addition of a co-advocate. United Earth Diplomatic Auxiliary, pursuant to Galactic Compact Article 15, Section 2, which grants any compact member species the right to present a cultural context brief in proceedings where doctrine-based execution is under consideration." Velvin Krath was on his feet before she finished the sentence. The tribunal should note that Article 15, Section 2 requires. The tribunal is aware of what it requires, Thesson Vor said, which was the closest I'd ever heard her come to cutting someone off. The request is valid. Co-advocate is acknowledged. Proceed. Velvin Krath sat down. His eyes had shifted from gold to a brighter, sharper amber. In Vethkani, that was elevated processing, stress response, though they would never call it that. The human stood up. He walked around the defense table to the advocate's standing position. He set his data case on the table with a quiet, deliberate click. He looked at the judicial bench, then at the gallery, then, briefly, calmly, at Vale Van Krath. Then he said, "My name is Callum Dara. I'm with the United Earth Diplomatic Auxiliary, and I'd like to tell you about what Vale Van Krath actually did on that corridor on Level 4 3 months ago, because I think the prosecution left something out." The gallery went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of procedural attention, the held breath quiet of a room full of beings who just felt something shift. Vale Van Krath leaned forward just slightly. Callum Dara didn't look at him. "Exhibit 7, Callum said. "The prosecution showed you 43 seconds of a 3-minute 22-second interaction and called it contamination risk. I want to show you the rest." He brought up the full corridor footage on the presentation display. And I watched the gallery watch the full clip. Because you need to understand, the 43 seconds Valvan had shown were accurate. Salvan had made physical contact with the child. She had displayed emotional response. All of that was in the full clip too. But the full clip started earlier. It started with the child alone. And over the course of that earlier footage, you could see 17 other beings walk past the distressed child without stopping. 17. Species from 10 different worlds, some of them with well-developed social bonding instincts, some of them with cultural traditions of community child protection. 17 beings walked past a lost, frightened child crying in a station corridor. And then Vale Van Krath walked into frame. And she stopped. The silence in the gallery lasted longer than silences usually do in a room full of 400 beings. Callum let it last. He didn't rush into the next point. He just stood there with his hands resting on the advocate table and let the room absorb what they'd seen. Then he said, quietly, "In my experience, the beings who stop, who notice something that's hurting and decide that matters more than where they were going, those are usually the ones we should be trying to protect." Part 2. Vale Van Krath's rebuttal was fast and sharp, and it didn't address the child. Of course it didn't address the child. He stood and he said, with the absolute precision of someone who has spent their entire life reducing things to their cleanest functional components, "The extended footage does not alter the evidence. The accused made physical contact with a non-Vethkani being. The accused displayed measurable emotional response. The number of other beings who did or did not interact with the Tylish juvenile is irrelevant to the contamination charge. The prosecution's position is unchanged." Callum Dara wrote something on a small pad, actual paper, which was unusual enough that I noticed it and waited. Thesson Vor looked between them and then said, "The co-advocate may continue." Callum looked up from the paper. "I'd like to ask the prosecution a question," he said, "if that's permissible under current proceedings." Thesson Vor looked at the Delvari and sect flanking her. A brief silent exchange. Then, "The prosecution may choose to respond or decline." "He's welcome to decline," Callum said, with the kind of casual reasonableness that I was starting to understand was one of his primary instruments. "The question's going into the record either way." Vale Van Krath said nothing. His amber eyes were very bright. "The question is this," Callum said. "You've known your sister your whole life. 47 cycles in the same family unit through the same educational pathway into the same research institution. You have shared memory, shared context, shared genetic origin. You told this tribunal in your opening statement that you are the closest witness to her contamination. So I want to ask you, and I genuinely want you to think about this before you answer or don't answer. Do you remember anything that she did, anything at all, that wasn't about helping someone? Any of the incidents you logged? Any of the behavior you recorded? Was any of it destructive?" The silence was different this time. It had an edge. Velvencrath sat very still, his eyes processed. They shifted through amber into something I hadn't seen before in Vethkani coloration, a kind of pale, uncertain gray. He didn't answer. Callum nodded like he'd expected that. No further question for the prosecution, he said, and went back to his notes. What Callum Dara did next in that hall was not what I expected from a United Earth Diplomatic Auxiliary representative. I'd met UEDA representatives before. They were typically a specific kind of person, excellent at protocol, good at languages, comfortable with procedural maneuvering. They were trained to work within systems, to find pathways, to smooth friction. Callum did all of that. But there was something else running underneath the procedural maneuvering that I want to try to describe accurately because it matters. He was genuinely angry. Not in a way he ever showed. Not in a way that would have been visible from the judicial bench as anything other than focused advocacy. But I was 3 rows back and I could see his hands on the advocate table, and I could see the way he held himself when N spoke. And I know what barely managed fury looks like because I've felt it myself, and that was what it looked like. He was furious. And he was doing something very specific with that fury, which was converting it, systematically and completely, into precision. Every word he said landed exactly where he aimed it. His formal presentation lasted 41 minutes and covered ground that nobody else in that hall had thought to cover, because nobody else had done what he'd clearly spent the recess doing, which was reading the full case file, all 3,000 pages of it, in something under 40 minutes. He started with Vethkani legal history. Not the purity doctrine, not Article 9, not the contemporary doctrine authority. He went back. He read 900 years of Vethkani jurisprudential record, and he found, in the original formulation of the purity doctrine, a clause that had been progressively subordinated over 3 centuries of subsequent doctrine amendments until it had effectively disappeared from the active legal framework. Clause 7 of the original Vethkani Cognitive Purity Accord. No cognitive purity measure shall be applied to an individual whose emotional responses have produced demonstrated net benefit to a third party being of lesser social capability or resource access, as such responses constitute a form of social computation that may exceed current doctrine's capacity to evaluate. He read it aloud, in Vethkani high dialect, which he spoke without an accent, which produced a visible ripple through the Vethkani section of the gallery. Then he said, in galactic standard, the Tylish child was 3 cycles old, which is early juvenile stage, and had been separated from her parent unit for approximately 40 minutes, during which time her stress response had elevated to a level that, according to Tylish pediatric medical literature, could produce lasting neurological impact if prolonged. Velvencrath's intervention reduced the child's stress response by measurable degrees and facilitated reunion within 8 minutes. Under Clause 7, which has never been formally repealed, only de-emphasized through subsequent amendments, this action constitutes the exact exemption the original accord described. Velvencrath said sharply, Clause 7 was superseded. It was not superseded, Callum said. I have the amendment chain here. It was subordinated twice in cycles 312 and 587. Subordination is not repeal. Under Vethkani constitutional doctrine, a subordinated clause remains legally active. It is simply deprioritized in standard application, but it is still there. He looked at the judicial bench. I'm requesting that the tribunal recognize Clause 7 as applicable to this case. Thessenvor called another recess, longer this time 2 hours. I didn't leave the gallery. I couldn't. I was aware that I had forgotten to maintain my timestamp log for the last 20 minutes, and I also couldn't bring myself to care. I watched Callum Dara at the defense table. He was talking with Oreth Sen in a low voice, going through what I assumed were additional case materials. He drank water from a standard station issue container, ate something from a small wrapped packet that looked like a nutrition bar, and made notes on that paper pad. In the breaks between working, he sat back and rubbed his eyes and looked at the ceiling for a few seconds and then came back down. He looked tired. He looked like someone who'd been working very hard for a very long time. He looked in that moment, deeply and completely human in a way that didn't have anything to do with species, and everything to do with recognizing someone who just isn't going to stop until they're done. At one point, Selvin Krath said something to him. I couldn't hear what. He leaned forward in his chair to listen, and I watched him listen, the particular quality of attention he brought to it, the way he kept his face still and open and didn't interrupt, and I thought, wherever he learned that, someone worked hard to teach it to him. He said something back to her. She looked down at her bound hands for a moment, then back at him, and she nodded. He nodded back. That was the whole exchange, and from 3 rows away it looked like something important happened in it, like something that had been held very tightly for a very long time loosened just a little. The session resumed at 12:51. What came next was the part that the press focused on afterward, the part that made it into the documentation that every interspecies law student in 3 sectors was assigned in the following year. But I want to say before I describe it that the legal argument, as interesting and important as it was, wasn't actually what mattered most about that afternoon. What mattered most was something smaller. But I'll get to that. Thesson Vore had clearly used the recess to do legal research. When she returned to the bench, she had the bearing of someone who had found something that changed her calculations, and she was being very careful about how she showed it. She asked Selvin Krath to respond to the Clause 7 argument. His response was careful, technically competent, and ultimately insufficient. He argued that Clause 7's application required the emotional response to be a primary and deliberate cognitive function deployed for social computation, rather than an incidental empathic reaction. He argued that Selvin's response to the Tylish child was the latter. Callum Dara said, the distinction between primary deliberate and incidental empathic is not made anywhere in Clause 7's text. The prosecution is asking the tribunal to accept an interpretive refinement that doesn't exist in the clause, that has never been formally established through Vethkani judicial precedent, and that would require the tribunal to essentially write new doctrine on behalf of the prosecution. That's not what tribunals do. Carol Umuth, the Del Valle on the judicial bench, said, Co-advocate, what remediation are you requesting, specifically? Callum said, specific dismissal of the termination order, return of the case to Vethkani Community Court for re-evaluation under Clause 7, and formal tribunal acknowledgement that Clause 7 remains active doctrine, because the station's Vethkani community needs to know that for future cases. There it was. Not just Selvin, future cases. He'd thought about future cases while reading that 3,000-page file in 40 minutes. The Vethkani section of the gallery didn't like that. I heard the shift, a collective change in posture, a series of the short, sharp exhalations that Vethkani use as the equivalent of dissent. Selvin Krath's expression remained controlled, but his eyes were fully amber now, elevated processing, sustained at high output. He made one more argument. And this one wasn't legal. This one was, in retrospect, a mistake, because it told the truth about what the whole proceeding had really been about. He said, the co-advocate appears to be motivated by a species-specific emotional attachment to the idea of emotional expression as inherently valuable. Humans are documented as having one of the highest emotional response baselines of any compact member species. The co-advocate's advocacy on behalf of the accused is itself a form of emotional contamination, and the tribunal should weigh his arguments accordingly. The gallery went still. Not the breath held still of a moment ago. Something more complicated. The still of a room where a lot of different beings with a lot of different emotional baselines just heard someone describe their entire interior experience as contamination. Callum Dara took a slow breath. I could see his hands on the table, very deliberate. He said, I want to respond to that, not legally, just personally. Thesson Vor looked at him for a long moment, then, proceed. What he said next was short, less than 2 minutes. I have it in my personal notes almost verbatim because I wrote it down while he spoke, forgetting again about the audio archive, not caring. He said, I'm going to concede the prosecution's point. I am emotionally engaged with this case. Seeing a clip of someone stopping to help a lost child, and then watching that action be used as a reason to execute her, yeah, that affected me. I'm not going to pretend otherwise because I don't see the benefit in pretending. Human beings don't generally benefit from pretending we're not feeling things. We've tried it. It doesn't improve our performance. It just makes us worse at knowing why we're doing what we're doing. But I want to offer a different framework than contamination for what that emotional engagement is doing in this room today. Because I've been in a lot of these proceedings, and in my experience, the cases where no one is emotionally engaged are the cases where the worst decisions get made. Not because emotion is always right. It isn't. Emotion is messy and inconsistent, and sometimes it points you in exactly the wrong direction. But disengagement isn't neutrality, it's just distance, and distance has its own distortions. What I know, sitting in this room today, is that there is a being standing on that platform who spent 3 minutes of her life trying to make a frightened child less afraid. And someone looked at that and decided it meant she should die. And I know, not as a legal argument, just as someone who's been alive for 38 years and paid attention, that something is very wrong with a system that reaches that conclusion. That's not contamination, that's information, and I think the tribunal should take it seriously. He sat down. Thesson Vor didn't call another recess. She conferred with Carol Umeth and Alaris in low voices for 7 minutes, which I know because I had finally remembered to look at the timestamp log. Then she straightened and addressed the hall. The tribunal finds Clause 7 of the original Vethkani cognitive purity accord applicable to the present case. The termination order issued by the Vethkani Community Court is stayed pending re-evaluation. The accused is to be released from tribunal restraint pending that re-evaluation, under standard station residency conditions. The tribunal further issues a formal advisory to the Vethkani Community Court that future proceedings involving Clause 7 eligible conduct be brought before this tribunal for review before any termination order is issued. She looked at Sylvan Krath. You are not free without condition, but you are free today. The hall didn't erupt. That happens in dramatic recreations, the crowd noise, the celebration. That's not what actually happened. What happened was a long, layered silence, and then a gradual return of sound. Many conversations starting at once in many languages. The kind of acoustic shift that happens when a room full of beings simultaneously decides that something important just occurred and needs to be processed. I looked at Sylvan Krath. The compressed light restraints were being removed by the court officer. She stood very still while they were removed. Then she brought her hands up in front of her and looked at them for a moment, just looked at them, like she was checking that they were still hers. Then she looked at Callum Dara. He was packing his data case. Not quickly, not slowly, just putting things away. He hadn't looked up yet. She said something to him. I was close enough to hear it this time. She said in careful galactic standard, her Vethkani accent making the vowels longer than standard. Why did you come? He looked up. He thought about it for a second. Genuinely thought about it, the way some people actually do when they're asked something they haven't pre-answered. I read the case summary last night, he said. The Clause 7 thing, I noticed it, so. She considered that. That is a small reason for a large risk. Yeah, he said, probably. He picked up the data case. It seemed like someone should, he said. He walked out the east door the same way he'd walked in. No fanfare, no ceremony. The door sealed behind him with that particular sound, the pressure shift, the quiet click, and he was gone. I looked at the prosecution table. Vailvan Krath was still seated. He hadn't moved during the announcement. He was looking at the central platform where his sister had been standing, but she had moved away now, was talking with Oreth Sen, and the platform was empty. His eyes were gray. Not the amber of elevated processing, not the gold of high cognitive function. Gray. I had been documenting Vethkani proceedings for 3 years, and I didn't know what gray meant. And when I looked it up afterward in the Vethkani emotional optical reference that most documentation clerks didn't have on their standard reading list, I found that gray was listed as an extremely rare state, documented in less than 2% of cases in the survey literature. The reference called it unresolved internal conflict producing temporary suppression failure, which is a very precise and very cold way of saying that something was happening inside Vailvan Krath that he didn't have language for, something that his entire architecture had been built to prevent. I don't know what it was. I'm not going to speculate. I'm just telling you what I saw, which was a man sitting very still in an empty room with gray eyes, alone at a table, while everyone else filed out. The formal case review took 4 months. At the end of it, the Vethkani Community Court, operating under the tribunal's Clause 7 advisory, determined that Vailvan Krath's conduct was Clause 7 eligible across all 7 documented incidents in the prosecution's case file. The termination order was permanently withdrawn. She continued to reside on Vethar Station. I saw her once, about 6 weeks after the proceeding, in the Level 2 food hall, one of those crowded, multi-species spaces where the air is complicated and the noise is constant and somehow it all works because everyone's just there to eat. She was sitting with a small group that included a Tylish adult, 2 Gorathi juveniles, and what I thought might be a sect cultural worker, though I couldn't be certain. She was talking. Her hands were moving in that Vethkani way, very precise, architectural, but the face above them was open and present in a way I recognized from the clip, from that moment after the child walked away, that quiet satisfaction. She looked up and saw me. She didn't look away. She held the eye contact for a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, which was the same length as that moment in the gallery before the proceedings, and then she nodded. I nodded back. That was all. I never found Kalimdara again. I tried, because I thought his version of what happened that day should be part of the record, not just mine. The United Earth Diplomatic Auxiliary Records listed him as active, assigned to an itinerant advocacy role in Sectors 3, 7, and 12, which is the kind of assignment that means a lot of short postings and not much time in one place. I sent a message to his auxiliary account 3 months after Vethar. He replied once, 4 weeks later, in a message that was 11 words long. Thanks for logging it. It mattered that someone was paying attention. I read that message maybe 12 times over the next few days, trying to work out what it meant exactly. I think, and this is just my interpretation, shaped by everything I know about what happened in Hall 3 that morning, I think he meant that the act of witnessing, of being present, of keeping a record even when you think it's just timestamps and procedural log entries, matters more than you can see in the moment. That the documentation isn't separate from the thing that happened. It's part of it. That someone was there, writing it down, making it real. The Vethar incident, as it was eventually classified, produced a formal review of compact obligations regarding doctrine-based execution proceedings. 3 years later, the tribunal authority issued standing guidelines requiring Clause 7 equivalent protections to be considered in all doctrine execution cases involving compact member species, regardless of whether the executing culture's internal law provided for such protections. The guidelines are officially called the Cognitive Purity Review Standards. Everyone at the station calls them the Krath precedent. I don't know if Salvin knows that. I like to think she does. Here is the thing I have tried to explain to every person who has ever asked me about that day. Every journalist and every law student and every person who heard about it and wanted to know what it was really like to be there. The miracle of it, and I use that word deliberately, knowing it doesn't really apply to a judicial proceeding, knowing it sounds overstated, the miracle of it wasn't the legal argument. The Clause 7 discovery was brilliant, and it mattered enormously. But brilliant legal arguments fail all the time in those halls, in the gaps between what the law says and what the room decides to do with what the law says. What didn't fail that day was something simpler. Someone read a 3,000-page case file in 40 minutes because he noticed something was wrong. Someone walked into a room of beings that could have ended his career, his compact credentials, his safety, and made a 3-minute speech about why not feeling things isn't the same as being right. Someone asked a question so simple and so direct that a man who had spent his entire life learning not to feel anything sat in silence and couldn't answer it. Do you remember anything that she did that wasn't about helping someone? The question that hung in the air of Hall 3 like something that had weight. The question that Salvin Krath couldn't answer, not because he was protecting himself, not because he was calculating, but because, somewhere underneath 900 years of cultural architecture and a lifetime of neurological suppression and all that precise, unweighted, amber-eyed certainty, he remembered. He remembered something. And that memory was gray. I went back to logging timestamps the next morning. Case designation VTA 3392 GRT, Gorathi Maritime Boundary, 8 hours, dry as stone, nothing worth writing down. I was very good at my job. But that afternoon, during the lunch break, I found the Tailish Community Quarter on level 4, and I walked through it for the first time. It was small and warm, and the air smelled like something I didn't have a name for, and there were children running between the circular housing units, six-limbed and fast, their subvocal sounds at the happy frequency, nothing like the frequency in the clip. I stood there for a while. Just stood there. And I thought about a tall, silver-skinned woman who had also once stood in a corridor and heard a sound that meant something was hurting, and decided that was information worth stopping for. And I thought about the fact that there are beings in this galaxy who would call that a disease. And I thought about a human being who walked into a room with a data case and a paper pad and 11 words worth of reply email and the exact right question. And I thought, of all the things we are, of all the things humans have been called in 37 years of compact membership, impulsive, irrational, overreactive, excessively attached, dangerously empathic. Maybe some of those are just another word for the same thing. Maybe stopping when something is hurting is just what you do when you're paying attention. Maybe the only real question is whether you've decided that's worth something.